Hey groupers, Pastor Marshall here. Excited to dig into the book of Ruth, one of my most favorite books in the whole Bible. Beautiful story. Well, when was a time in your life when you ran away from or you ignored a responsibility? Just an icebreaker. Let's start in the shallow end of the pool. What was just some practical physical thing? I talked about tires on my car. What's just a time that you ran away from or ignored a responsibility and it just didn't end well? Start in the shallow end of the pool and think about some physical things, share some stories, and then move a little deeper. What were some emotional things, some relational things that you ignored, problems that you ignored, and how did that work out? And then finally, where we want to get to is spiritual. What are some things in your life, times in your life when you ignored some spiritual responsibilities, and how did that end? Well, the story starts with Naomi and her husband Elimelech, and they make three mistakes right away. What three mistakes did Naomi and her husband make? And when you think about those mistakes, after you list them, how can we today avoid making these same mistakes? If you went back in time, if you could be the leader of Naomi's family before they decided to leave for Moab, what do you think are some of the things that you would have wrestled with before you made the decision? I'm not saying you would have made the same decision, but just in the midst of all that they were going through, what are just some things that you would have wrestled with if you had been in charge of making this decision? Well, when trouble comes into our lives, we can endure it, we can escape it, or we can enlist it. That's what I talked about in my message on Sunday. I want you just to talk about what each of those options means. What do they look like? What does it mean to escape, to endure, to escape, or to enlist an obstacle, trouble in our lives? What was wrong with Naomi's motivation to go back to Bethlehem? I shared with you that I think that she had a bad motivation. What was wrong with her motivation? And could she have fixed her motivation? Could she still have returned to Bethlehem, but for completely different reasons? If so, what would that have looked like? Well, she's on her way. Daughter-in-laws are with her. Orpah chooses to return. Why do you think that she chose to return? And should we find any fault in Orpah's decision to go back to Moab? And then Ruth. Why do you think that Ruth was so determined to go with Naomi? What do you think her reasons were? What were her motivations? How has God, as we get to the end of this first chapter, and we're just thinking about Ruth, how has God demonstrated his grace to in Ruth's life so far? At this point in the story, how has God already demonstrated his grace in Ruth's life? Do you think, the end of the story, in the end of the first chapter, do you think that Naomi was exaggerating her situation? Did she have any reasons to be thankful? Or was everything just bad and awful? What happens to us when we concentrate more on ourselves, more on our problems, and we don't keep our eyes on God? What happens to us when we do that? And then what experiences have you had in starting over? Ruth and Naomi are going to start over back in Bethlehem. What stories do you have of starting new? It might relate back to some of the troubles that you had earlier that we started with. Well, finally, let's not forget our application. Where are you going to turn back to God in faith this week? As they go back to Bethlehem, we're reminded that they're going back to God. And over again, this is something that's necessary in our lives. Where are you turning back to God this week? Well, I hope that's a great group. I look forward to the next piece of Ruth 2. God bless.